There is a moment, quiet and unremarkable from the outside, when something inside a person breaks open. Not break down, breaks open. It happens to a certain kind of person. The one who has spent a lifetime feeling too much, absorbing too much, giving too much. The one who walks into a room and immediately knows who is hurting. The one who cannot pass a stranger crying without feeling the weight of that grief settle into their own chest as though it belonged there. The one who has been called sensitive their entire life, as if sensitivity were a diagnosis, as if feeling deeply were a condition to be treated, to be managed, to be quietly ashamed of. We call these people empaths. For decades, perhaps for their entire lives, they have been everyone's safe place, everyone's emotional anchor. The one people call at 2 in the morning, the one who listens without judgment, forgives without being asked, and returns again and again to people who continue to wound them. Because something inside them insists that everyone deserves understanding, that everyone is carrying invisible pain, that patience is the highest and most sacred form of love. But Carl Jung understood a truth about the empath that most people never discover. He knew that the sensitivity, that extraordinary, almost supernatural ability to feel the emotional world of others, was not the whole truth of who they were. He knew that beneath the endless compassion, beneath the selfless giving, beneath the soft and yielding surface the empath showed to the world, there was something else entirely, something locked away in the dark for years, sometimes for a lifetime, something the empath had been running from with every act of generosity, every sacrifice, every quiet moment of self-erasure. Jung called it the shadow. He had spent decades descending into the unconscious depths of both himself and his patients. And what he came back convinced of was this: until a person went down into their own shadow and faced what lived there, they could never become whole. This is the story of what happens when an empath finally does that, and of what they become on the other side of the descent. I want to tell you, before we go any further, that the person who emerges from that process is nothing, absolutely nothing, like who they were before. So complete is the transformation, so thorough, so total, that the people who knew the empath before, who loved them, depended on them, even took advantage of them, are shocked when they meet this integrated, whole person. Not because the empath has become cold, not because the empath has become selfish, not because something beautiful has been lost, but because something ancient and powerful and unmistakably real has finally been found. To understand what integration does to an empath, you first have to understand what an empath truly is. Not in the popular sense, not the social media version of the word, where being an empath has become an identity, a brand, sometimes even a reason to avoid accountability. In the deep, Jungian, psychological sense of the word. For Jung, the human psyche was not a simple thing. It was vast, layered, filled with forces and energies that most people never consciously encounter. At the center of the conscious mind sat the ego, the part of us that says, I am this, not that. The ego is the gatekeeper. It decides what we show to the world, what we allow ourselves to feel, what we permit ourselves to want. And it decides, just as crucially, what we push away from our awareness and into the dark. The empath is someone whose ego has been shaped by a very specific kind of wound. Most empaths did not emerge from the womb with their extraordinary sensitivity already formed. They were made. The sensitivity developed, often though not always, as a survival strategy. Maybe they grew up where the emotional atmosphere was unpredictable, where a parent's mood could shift without warning, where the emotional temperature of the home changed faster than a child could adapt, where reading other people's feelings was not a luxury but a necessity, a skill the child built out of a need to stay safe, to stay connected, to know what was coming before it arrived. A child who must constantly monitor the emotional state of the adults around them develops a rare capacity over time, an almost preternatural ability to read people. They learn to sense tension before it surfaces, to feel the shift in a room before anything is said. In psychological terms, they become hypervigilant, and this hypervigilance, refined over years and then decades, begins to look indistinguishable from empathy. It is empathy, real empathy, the actual ability to feel what others feel, but it is also, at its root, a wound that learned to look like a gift. Jung observed that when children are forced to suppress parts of themselves, to survive, to remain loved, to belong, those suppressed parts do not disappear, they go underground. They sink into the unconscious and wait there in the dark, still alive, still carrying all the energy they were born with, still shaping the person from below, from a place where the person cannot see them, cannot name them, cannot consciously choose what to do with them. This is the shadow. Naming what the empath has sent into that dark is not difficult, once you know what to look for. Anger goes there first. The healthy, normal, human anger that arises when you are mistreated, when your needs are disregarded, when your limits are crossed again and again without consequence. The empath was often taught, early in life, that anger was dangerous, that expressing it would result in abandonment, in punishment, in the withdrawal of the love they needed to survive. So the anger was packed away, hidden carefully beneath a surface of understanding, transformed into shapes more socially acceptable, into patience, into the compulsive ability to always see the other person's perspective, into the reflexive habit of making excuses for people who do not deserve them. Selfishness goes there too, or what the empath was taught to see as selfishness, which was often nothing more than the basic, ordinary human desire to have needs, to have preferences, to sometimes, without guilt or explanation, choose themselves first. This was labeled selfish in their early environment. So they learned to want less, ask for less, need less, and eventually they stopped being able to feel their own needs at all. The needs were still there. The connection to them had been severed. Power goes into the shadow as well. The capacity to assert oneself, to say no without a 3-paragraph apology, to claim space in a room, to lead rather than serve. All of this was uncomfortable in the environments that shaped the empath, and so it was buried. Desire goes there last. Not only romantic desire, but the whole territory of personal wanting. Ambition, hunger, the naked drive to pursue a thing because you want it, because it calls to you, because it is yours to pursue. This entire category of experience was sealed away behind the need to be good, to be helpful, to be the person everyone could count on. What emerges from all of this? An adult who cannot access their own anger until it has been so compressed, so long suppressed, that when it surfaces, it frightens even them. An adult who cannot feel their own needs directly, who must root desire through other people, helping others get what they want as the only route to what they themselves want, without ever having to admit they want it. An adult who is generous to the point of self-erasure, not always out of true selflessness, but because the self has been buried so thoroughly that there is almost nothing left of it to be selfish with. Meet the empath before integration, beautiful, gifted, exhausted in ways they cannot quite explain. and largely unaware of the prison they are living in, because the prison is built from the same material as their greatest qualities. There is an idea that runs through the entire Jungian tradition, repeated by a century of his students and successors. The gold is in the shadow. Few ideas in depth psychology are more counterintuitive, and few take longer to grasp. The shadow, that dark interior space where we have thrown everything we were told was unacceptable about ourselves, is not merely a chamber of horrors. It is not only the home of shame and rage and ugliness. It is also where our unlived potential waits. That dark space holds the empath's power. All of it. Every ounce of it. Every quality that was suppressed in the empath. Every impulse toward self-assertion. Every spark of ambition. Every flash of righteous anger. Every raw and honest desire. It is all still there. Still alive, still carrying tremendous psychic energy, stored in the unconscious like water behind a dam, pressing against the walls that keep it contained, slowly weakening those walls by the sheer force of its own existence, waiting to be claimed. But claiming it is not easy. The integration process, what Jung called individuation, is not a weekend workshop. It is not a meditation retreat, or a journaling exercise, or an online course about healing your inner child, though all of those can be useful alongside it. Individuation is a true psychological descent, sometimes spanning years, sometimes a decade or more, in which a person must confront every part of themselves they have spent a lifetime pretending does not exist. For the empath, this descent almost always begins with a crisis. The crisis takes many forms. It might be a relationship that collapses at last under the weight of the empath's martyrdom, the moment they realize, with the devastating clarity only exhaustion can produce, that they have been giving everything and receiving almost nothing. That they not only allowed this dynamic, but recreated it, again and again, in every significant relationship in their life. It might be an emotional breakdown, the repressed anger and grief and unacknowledged need of decades, refusing to stay underground any longer, erupting through the surface of a carefully maintained composure. It might be a depression so profound that it cannot be medicated away, or affirmed away, or survived until it passes. A depression that, if the empath is willing to descend into it, rather than flee it, to ask what it is saying, rather than demanding it stop, turns out to be the doorway into their own shadow. Whatever form the crisis takes, what is being demanded of the empath in that moment is a kind of courage that looks nothing like courage from the outside. Because from the outside, the empath in the middle of their individuation process looks frankly like they are falling apart. They become less available, less agreeable, less inexhaustibly patient and understanding. They begin to establish limits around what they will and will not accept, abruptly sometimes, clumsily sometimes, because they have no practice at it, because they are learning in real time what it even means to have a self that requires protecting. They begin to withdraw from relationships that have been draining them for years, relationships that felt impossible to leave, because the empath could always find one more reason to extend compassion to the person who was depleting them. Predictability goes next. The people in their lives, people who built the entire relationship around the expectation of endless giving, endless patience, endless return, begin to notice. And many of them do not like what they notice. Jung named a phenomenon we rarely discuss in conversations about shadow work: enantiodromia, the tendency of any extreme to swing toward its opposite when it is pushed far enough, held long enough, suppressed hard enough. The empath who has spent a lifetime at the extreme of self-sacrifice, when they begin to integrate their shadow, often swings briefly toward what looks like selfishness. They become temporarily more focused on themselves, more protective of their limits, less instantly available for other people's emergencies, less reflexively willing to absorb other people's pain as their own responsibility. To onlookers, this can look alarming. It can look like the empath has been taken over by a darkness that is undoing all the good in them. The people who depended on their endless availability may feel robbed, threatened even, because the person they knew was someone they could predict, someone who would always take what was done to them and come back with open arms. But this is not the empath becoming someone worse. This is the empath finding their center. Think of it like this: a person who has spent 40 years leaning hard to one side, so long that their whole psychological structure has distorted itself around the lean, cannot just stand upright in one smooth movement. They must first swing the other way. They must overcorrect, at least for a while, to find the center that was never available to them before. The overcorrection is not the destination, it is the passage. The center, the integrated self the empath is moving toward, is a person no one around them has ever met, a person the empath themselves has never been. So what does the integrated empath actually look like? Quick pause before we go there. If what you're hearing is resonating, take 1 second to subscribe. Jung, the shadow, and the psychology of becoming whole are exactly the territory this channel explores. Now, back to the transformation. 4 qualities emerge in a person who has done this work, who has descended into their own shadow, claimed the gold waiting there, and come back carrying what they found. And the 4th is the one almost nobody talks about. The first thing you notice is that they are still deeply empathetic. The sensitivity does not disappear. The ability to feel the emotional world of others does not leave them, but it changes in one fundamental and crucial way. Before integration, the empath's empathy was compulsive, automatic. They had no choice about whether to absorb other people's pain. It happened, reflexively, the moment they stepped into proximity with another person's suffering. They would walk away from a difficult conversation, carrying the other person's emotions like luggage they had not packed. They would lie awake at night, worrying about people who were not lying awake, worrying about them. They would sacrifice their own peace repeatedly, almost habitually, to manage other people's discomfort. After integration, the empathy is still there, but it is conscious, deliberate, chosen. The integrated empath can feel the pain of the person in front of them without being consumed by it. They can sit with suffering, eyes open, without armor or distance, without drowning in it. They have developed what psychologists call equanimity, a deep emotional stability that can remain steady inside great feeling without being destabilized by it. This is not coldness, it is not detachment, it is a capacity far richer and far rarer than either. It is mastery. The second quality is the one that surprises people most, the one that produces the shock I mentioned at the beginning. Out of the descent comes a contained, directed, unashamed personal power that is striking to witness. Before integration, they were powerful too, but the power was hidden, rerouted. They would accomplish things by helping others accomplish things. They would lead by following, invisibly, from behind. They would change situations through the slow, patient pressure of sheer endurance and goodwill. After integration, the power is direct, unhidden. They learn to lead openly, to speak plainly and without apology, to pursue their own goals and their own vision with a clarity and confidence that can shock people who knew them before. The person who spent years championing everyone else's ambitions suddenly has unmistakable ambitions of their own. The person who was always in the supporting role walks to the center of the stage and looks entirely comfortable there. Arrogance has nothing to do with it, and neither does any loss of sensitivity or kindness. The change is simpler than that. They have stopped apologizing for taking up space. They have stopped rooting their power through other people because they no longer need to. They have found the direct line to their own will, and they have discovered, maybe for the first time in their lives, that they are allowed to use it. What does love look like, coming from a person like this? The third quality is the most profound of all. The integrated empath becomes capable of a love qualitatively different from anything they offered before. Their love, before integration, was conditional in a specific and paradoxical way. It depended on the other person needing them. The empath loved most intensely when they were needed most desperately. Their capacity for devotion was activated, almost ignited, by other people's pain, other people's helplessness, other people's crises. This is why empaths so often end up in relationships with people who are emotionally unavailable or addicted or in perpetual crisis, or displaying what we now recognize as narcissistic patterns. The empath is not broken, and they are not drawn to cruelty. Their particular wound resonates with a particular kind of wound in others. They know, at some unconscious level, exactly how to love someone who needs saving, and they have not yet learned how to love someone who does not. On the other side of that work, the empath can love in the absence of need. They can love someone who is strong. They can love someone who does not require rescuing, who does not offer the familiar dynamic of giving and receiving and giving again without return. They can love in a way that is not secretly about filling their own emptiness, because integration means they have begun to fill that emptiness themselves. Through the long, painful, transformative work of meeting their own shadow, befriending their own dark, and building a relationship with the full truth of who they are. Love, for the first time, becomes truly free, not given out of fear of abandonment, not given to manage another person's pain so the empath can avoid their own feeling of helplessness, not given as an unconscious transaction dressed in the language of generosity, just given, because they choose to, because it is good, because it is real, because the person in front of them has earned it, and they are choosing, with full awareness, to offer it. This kind of love is rare, and it is transformative, deeply, lastingly, for everyone who receives it. Now we need to talk about the part of this that rarely gets spoken about, because it is painful, and it deserves honest acknowledgement. Integration costs something. Not every relationship survives what the empath becomes. Some relationships were built around the old model, the model where the empath was the giver and the other person the receiver, where the dynamic was stable precisely because the empath kept giving without asking for anything in return. When the empath begins to change, begins to ask for reciprocity, begins to withdraw the bottomless supply of emotional labor they have been providing, these relationships often turn turbulent before they either transform or end. Some people respond to the changed empath with outright fury. They feel robbed of a resource they had come to regard as their right. They will say you've changed as though change itself were a betrayal. They will say you're not who I fell in love with, not who I've always known, not who I need you to be, and they will be right, in the most literal sense. The empath is no longer who they were, no longer manageable in the way they once were, no longer predictable in their forgiveness, no longer guaranteed to absorb whatever is done to them and return with warmth. That prospect frightens people who built the relationship on the old guarantee, but other people, people of real depth, people who loved the empath for who they were, rather than for what they provided, often respond to the transformation with something close to reverence. Because what the empath carries back from their shadow is extraordinary. They carry back a wisdom available only to those who have known deep suffering and walked through it with eyes open, refusing to look away. They carry back a compassion that is vast, unconditional, and non-transactional, because it now comes from fullness rather than lack. They carry back a strength tested in the hottest fires of the self, a strength that did not break, quiet in the way only proven things are quiet. And they carry back what might be the rarest quality a human being can possess, the ability to sit with another person's darkness without flinching, without rushing to fix it, without needing it to resolve into anything more comfortable before they can remain in the room. No wonder the person on the other side of this work so often becomes one of the most healing presences in every environment they inhabit. Not through giving more than before, through being present as they never were before. They have descended into their own abyss and found that it did not destroy them, which means, at the deepest level, they are no longer afraid of yours. Jung wrote a line that has stayed with me across years of returning to his work. He wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. There is a harder teaching he left us as well, one that speaks directly to this journey, that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. This was not a casual remark. It came from a man who had spent his life in the depths of human psychology, watching person after person flee from the devastating, liberating truth of their own wholeness. Self-acceptance for the empath is particularly terrifying. Accepting oneself completely means accepting the anger, accepting the power, accepting the ambition and the desire and the capacity for self-assertion and everything else that was sent into the shadow for being unacceptable. It means accepting the parts that do not fit the image of perfect compassion, the parts that are not beautiful or gentle or easy to love. And yet, Jung believed, and a century of psychology has confirmed, that until we accept those parts, until we integrate them rather than exile them, they do not go away. They operate from the unconscious instead, shaping our choices, our relationships, our patterns. Without our knowledge or consent, they pull the strings of our life from behind a curtain we refuse to look behind. A fourth gift comes back from the shadow with them, the one I said almost nobody talks about, and the most practical of all. They receive access to their own instincts. Their instincts, before this work, were buried under the noise of other people's needs and other people's emotions. They could feel what others needed with remarkable clarity, but they often had almost no idea what they themselves needed. They could sense when someone else was in trouble, but they could not sense when they themselves were being harmed, even when the harm was obvious to everyone around them. The very sensitivity that made them so gifted at reading others was paradoxically turned almost completely off when it came to their own interior experience. That blindness is why empaths are so often the last to know when they are being manipulated. It is why they remain in damaging dynamics long past the point where a more self-connected person would have left. Not because they are unintelligent, not because they cannot see what is happening, but because the internal alarm, the part that says, "This is not right, this is not safe, I deserve better," has been silenced, along with the anger and the power and all the rest of what was buried. Then the internal signal system comes back online. Now the empath begins to receive and trust their own instincts in a way they never could. They feel when something is wrong, in a situation, in a conversation, in a pattern beginning to repeat, and they trust what they feel. They do not immediately override it with empathy for the other person's circumstances. They do not dismiss it with the voice that says, "You're being too sensitive," or "Who are you to have needs of your own?" They feel it, they honor it, and they act on it. That restored signal makes them, for the first time in their lives, genuinely safe. Not only a safe place for others, safe for themselves. Of all the shifts in this transformation, this may be the most radical. The empath who spent their life as the sanctuary for every other person has become their own sanctuary. The person who could hold space for every other person's pain has finally learned to hold space for their own. I want to speak directly to anyone watching this and recognizing themselves. Anyone in the middle of this process, in the chaos and confusion of their own individuation, not yet knowing what they are becoming, who is setting limits they have never set before and watching some relationships destabilize around them, who is feeling their anger for maybe the first time and not knowing what to do with it, who is pulling back from the constant giving and feeling something between relief and terror at the space opening up. You are not going backward. You are not becoming a worse person, a more selfish person, a person who has lost the beautiful things that made them who they are. You are becoming a whole person. If you recognize yourself somewhere in this process, tell me in the comments where you are, the descent, the swing, or the return. Others walking this road will read your words and feel less alone. The path toward wholeness always passes through chaos, always, without exception. The self trying to emerge in you, the integrated self that contains both the light you have always shown to the world and the dark that has been waiting in the shadow, cannot be born without tearing through the container that held the partial version of you. That tearing is painful, it is disorienting. It can look, from the outside, and sometimes from the inside as well, like destruction rather than transformation, but you are not being destroyed, you are being made whole. As for the old version of you, the empath, who was only the giver, only the healer, only the one who felt everything except their own feelings, that person was not broken. They were not wrong. They were doing exactly what they needed to do to survive the conditions they were given. Honor them. Have deep compassion for them. They carried you here. They kept you alive long enough to reach the place where the shadow can finally be faced. But you are not required to remain that person forever. Here is the most important thing I can tell you. What you are becoming is not less than what you were. It is more, so much more. Jung believed that the purpose of human life was not happiness, not comfort, not the avoidance of suffering, not the smooth passage from cradle to grave without too much pain. The purpose, he believed, was wholeness, the real kind, the kind that excludes nothing, that requires no part of the self to be suppressed, to be presentable, that contains darkness alongside the light, with no apology and no shame. An empath who undertakes this journey, who descends into their shadow, faces what waits there, and comes back carrying their own gold, becomes one of the rarest kinds of human beings alive. They become someone who can feel the full range of human experience without being consumed by any of it. Someone who can be with suffering, their own and others, without fleeing it, numbing against it, or managing it from a careful distance. Someone who has stood in the absolute depths of themselves and survived, and who carries that survival not as a wound, but as a resource, as a kind of knowing that cannot be taught or theorized, only lived. In the deepest sense of Jung's vision, they have made the unconscious conscious. Turn the lead of their wound into the gold of their wisdom, completed, at least in part, The great work Jung believed every human soul is here to do. Then there are the people who knew them before. The ones who knew the soft, selfless, generous version, who loved that version, who depended on it in ways they never acknowledged. When those people encounter this new person, integrated, whole, alive, still carrying all the warmth they ever had, but now carrying alongside it something unshakable and luminous and unmistakably their own, they are shocked, because they are looking at someone who is, for the very first time, fully here, fully present, fully themselves, watching an empath finally take up the space they always deserved, no longer performing half of themselves, no longer apologizing for the parts that were never welcome in the rooms that shaped them, is an extraordinary thing to behold. This is what Carl Jung meant when he said that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. It is also what he taught, that this acceptance is the greatest gift a human being can offer the world. If you are on this path, keep going. What you are becoming is worth everything it is costing you. Out there, the real world, the one that needs whole people who have walked through their own fire, not just people who have never been burned, is waiting for you on the other side.